Be like Daniel. Be like David. Be like Moses. Be like Esther, right? Well, in this passage, let me just prime the pump this way. Would you be telling your daughter or your granddaughter to be in this kind of situation? Let's hear what the Word of God says. After these things, when the anger of King Ahasuerus had abated, he remembered Vashti and what she had done and what had been decreed against her. Then the king's young men who attended him said, "Let beautiful young virgins be sought out for the king, and let the king appoint officers in all the provinces of his kingdom to gather all the beautiful young virgins to the harem in Susa the citadel, under custody of Haggai, the king's eunuch, who is in charge of the women. Let their cosmetics be given to them, and let the young woman who pleases the king be queen instead of Vashti." This pleased the king, and he did so. Now there was a Jew in Susa, the citadel, whose name was Mordecai, the son of Jair, son of Shimei, son of Kish, a Benjaminite, who had been carried away from Jerusalem among the captives, carried away with Jeconiah, king of Judah, whom Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, had carried away. He was bringing up Hadassah, that is, Esther, the daughter of his uncle, for she had neither father nor mother. The young woman had a beautiful figure and was lovely to look at. And when her father and her mother died, Mordecai took her as his own daughter. So when the king's order and his edict were proclaimed, and when many young women were gathered in Susa, the citadel, in custody of Haggai, Esther was also taken into the king's palace and put in custody of Haggai, who had charge of the women. And the young woman pleased him and won his favor. And he quickly provided her with her cosmetics and her portion of food, and with 7 chosen young women from the king's palace, and advanced her and her young women to the best place in the harem. Esther had not made known her people or her kindred, for Mordecai had commanded her not to make it known. And every day Mordecai walked in front of the court of the harem to learn how Esther was and what was happening to her. Now, when the turn came for each young woman to go into the king Ahasuerus, after being 12 months under the regulations for the women, since this was the regular period of their beautifying, 6 months with oil of myrrh, and 6 months with spices and ointments for women. When the young woman went in to the king in this way, she was given whatever she desired to take with her from the harem to the king's palace. In the evening, she would go in, and in the morning, she would return to the second harem in custody of Shashgaz, the king's eunuch, who was in charge of the concubines. She would not go into the king again unless the king delighted in her, and she was summoned by name. When the turn came for Esther, the daughter of Abihail, the uncle of Mordecai, who had taken her as his own daughter to go into the king, she asked for nothing except what Haggai, the king's eunuch, who was in charge of the women, advised. Now Esther was winning favor in the eyes of all who saw her. And when Esther was taken to King Ahasuerus into his royal palace in the 10th month, which is the month of Tebeth, in the 7th year of his reign, the king loved Esther more than all the women, and she won grace and favor in his sight more than all the virgins, so that he set the royal crown on her head and made her queen instead of Vashti. Then the king gave a great feast for all his officials and servants. It was Esther's feast. He also granted a remission of taxes to the provinces and gave gifts with royal generosity. So what do we do when the way forward isn't clear? What do we do when it seems like the only decision you have is to choose between the lesser of two evils? That's what you have here in this passage. It's choosing between the lesser of two evils. But I don't think that's where most of us live, right? Most of us don't live in choosing between the lesser of two evils. We might actually be choosing between the greater of two goods. So it also works the same way as you look at this passage. It helps you understand really how to discern what God's will is, and to do it without going crazy, to do it without second-guessing yourself all the time. And that's the big principle that we see here in this passage. When your path doesn't seem clear, do your best and trust in God. Does that sound like a theologically lightweight thing to say? Does that seem like a lightweight? I mean, do your best and trust in God. I mean, to me that sounds kind of like, did I go to seminary to really tell you guys that? Do your best and trust in God. It does kind of feel a little lightweight, but I want you to see that this is actually a big portion of what being a person of faith is all about, is doing your best and trusting God. In the beginning of this story, what we saw is you see this King Xerxes. Now he's got a huge ego, ginormous ego, folks. This was a person who had one big appetite after another come upon him. As we were reading last week, we saw him throw this huge party, and what it really is, it was a war council in order to convince his allies, hey, join me in forces. When I say come, I need you to join me in this war against Greece. I need you to join me. And in the process of having this great feast, the alcohol is freely pouring, people are freely partaking, and then he says, hey, this is going absolutely great. Let's bring Queen Vashti in here, and Queen Vashti says no. And that's the point, is that in the midst of the king trying to convince everybody else that he's someone worth following, she won't even come to this party. And so as a result, she is deposed from her position. She loses her position as the queen of Persia. Well, so what, Bill? This is the thing that God is going to use in the life of Israel to rescue them from destruction. He's going to use a wife's refusal to come to the party to rescue a people from a vast genocide that's about to take place. So after that no comes, and after Queen Vashti realizes that she's no longer in the penthouse, that she's actually in that small little apartment around the corner over there, and they're going to put her over there, then 4 years pass between chapters 1 and chapter 2. What takes place is King Xerxes, he takes 2 million soldiers on a conquest. And it is an absolute disaster. Hardly anyone makes it back alive. And in the process, the king has depleted the national treasury, and his subjects do not think very well of him. So this is what happened in the years following around 485. And you may have heard of something. A lot of these battles, they can be documented in places like Herodotus, his ancient annals of warfare. But this was a king who called himself, get this, the King of Kings. That was his title for himself. But he wasn't. He wasn't all that. And it's in the wake of this absolute failure that we see the events of chapter 2 take place. See, what's going on here is his guys in the court, they're like, listen, Xerxes gets crazy even in the best of times. Even in the best of circumstances, he's not easy to deal with. We need to get him a queen quickly so that he'll be focusing on that and not focusing on the fact that no one really wants to follow him into battle anymore. And so that's what happens here. These rulers, they say, hey, let's get all these beautiful virgins from the kingdom. Let's replace Queen Vashti. Who's Queen Vashti? She's nothing. You're everything, king. So let's bring in these ladies. Let's doll them up. And they have one job, and that job is to please you. And that absolutely strokes Xerxes' ego. He's like, oh yeah, I like this plan. In fact, we read it in verse 4. At the end of verse 4, it says, this pleased the king, and he did so. That was the plan that we see that is hatched in verses 1 through 4. And then we see in verses 5 through 7, I've called it a process. It's basically giving you a rundown of the events. The virgins, how can I, it almost sounds like it's a harvest. Like they're being gathered. Like their wheat to be gathered into a barn. But this is the way that King Xerxes looked at all the world. That people were always there for his delight, for his use. This wasn't something that just happened to the girls, by the way. Every year, there would be 500 young men who would be taken from their homes. They would be brought into the king's presence. They would be castrated, and then they would become court attendants. So this is how this Persian king worked all the time. So in many ways, this was normal. So this is kind of normal for this very ego-driven king. And then we read in verse 5 about this guy named Mordecai. Now, we're going to learn more about Mordecai next week, but I do want you to notice this, that when we go up to if you'll look around verse 5 and see what is said about Mordecai, look at verse 6. He had been carried away from Jerusalem among the captives, carried away with Jeconiah, king of Judah, whom Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, had carried away. So there's a very real sense. Imagine that you're out at sea and that there's been this tide that's just carried you away. That's the kind of picture that the author of this book is wanting to show you. He's wanting to show you that Mordecai has no control over this. In fact, if you go on to verse 7, you're going to see that he was bringing up Hadassah, and you're going to read about Hadassah. Her name is also Esther. More about that in just a second. But we see that she was taken to the king's palace in verse 8. So there's all these people that they really have no control over this. They can't, the decisions they get to make is just of the lesser of two evils, really. Are you going to go along with what the king has commanded that you're going to do or not? They have very little control. Have you ever felt like in your life, have you ever felt like that you have very little control, that you're just being carried around, and that you're having to make the choice of the lesser of these two evils? Well, this is something that Mordecai knew about. This is something that Esther knew about. And what is up with her having two names mentioned here? You see in verse 7, he was bringing up Hadassah, that is Esther. Why in the world is she referred to by both of those names? I think that what the author is trying to do is show you something, that she has two identities. She has her Jewish identity, and she has the identity that the rest of the world sees. I think as Christians, we should be able to identify with that too. If you've ever worked in the workplace, there's the you that goes to church on Sunday, right? And then there's the you that has to go to work on Monday. And how am I going to be able to integrate who I am on Sunday with who I am on Monday through Saturday? How is that going to work out? Well, the rest of this book shows the integration of Esther becoming a whole person, but that's going to be about 8 chapters away. So let's just stick with where we are for now. For now, the question is, what are you going to do, Esther? Are you going to go along with what the king is proposing or not? It's really a yes or no proposal. And in verse 9, she decides to go with the flow. Let's look at that verse again, because it's key in understanding what Esther decides to do. The young woman, pleased, she appears before Haggai. It's actually in verse 8 that she goes into the custody of Haggai. Esther was also taken into the king's palace and put in the custody of Haggai, who had charge of the women. And then in verse 9 we read, and the young woman pleased him and won his favor, and he quickly provided her with her cosmetics and her portion of food, and with 7 chosen young women from the king's palace, and advanced her and her young women to the best place in the harem. Esther goes along with it. She plays the game. Now, is this something that we would recommend to any young woman? Because when we read the passage, if we read this passage like, be like David, be like Daniel, be like Esther, no, we can't read the passage in this way. Because this passage really isn't about, and this whole book isn't really about Esther or Mordecai or even Xerxes. The passage is about God. What is God going to do, and how is he going to sovereignly act when the rest of them have no control whatsoever? That's what's going on in this passage overall as we continue to look at moving from the plan to this process where Esther plays the game. And this leads us to this pageant of sorts. That's what I've called it. It's in verses 12 through 18. Now, this was one of the favorite books for Jewish people to read. Also, fun fact, if you were in Nazi-occupied Germany, it was a capital offense to have a copy of this on you. Or maybe not so fun fact. But how did all the Jewish people feel about Esther? Because I think, as I'm reading this, I would think that she's their hero, right? Not necessarily. Here's how one rabbi talked about Esther and Mordecai. And this is a shortened up version, of course. He wrote, why did Mordecai not risk his life to take her to some deserted place to hide until the danger would pass? Where was his righteousness, his piety, and his valor? She too should have tried to commit suicide before allowing herself to have intercourse with him. Because that's the issue that's going on here. This is Esther being placed in moral danger. So I don't want us to get this idea that everyone that has celebrated this festival of Purim has looked upon Esther as being guiltless in this. That she made a right decision here. There have been a lot of people that 2,000, 3,000 years later have played Monday morning quarterback on her. So here in this passage, just as we look at it, there's no polite way to put it. The king evidently had sexual relations with a different virgin every night or whenever he pleased. And if you go to books like Herodotus, as you read about his annals of warfare, you will also read about Xerxes. His appetites were very well known. He was one of the most prolific, shall I say, hedonists. He was known for taking liberties with his own officers' wives. So this is the kind of man that you're having to deal with here. He was, in many ways, a monster. So, should we cancel Esther because she didn't commit suicide? What should we do? What should Esther do in this situation? Let me go back to what I said before. Esther, do your best and trust God. Do the best that you can and trust God. Because it seems like there are so many instances, and this is one of them in the scriptures, where it seems that God is silent, doesn't it? Where's God in the midst of all this? That is the series that we're talking about, is where is our God? So where's God in the midst of this? What should we do when the best that we can do is the best that we can do? And to trust God. Well, the first thing I want to remind us is that Esther is in a rather strange place not most of us will ever be. Most of us are having to make decisions really between the better of two options, thankfully, because of where we live. But there are people around the world who are brothers and sisters in Christ who do not have this option. And so to them, we have to pray for them, and we have to say, we have to trust in God, that God will, that we don't have to, we don't have to speak for God, that God can speak for himself, that God sustains us, that he sustains the church. And what I want us to know is that the choice that you are being asked to make in your own personal life, if God is sovereign, can you ruin that choice? Can you mess things up so bad that God can't fix it? See, if God can fix this, he can fix anything.